One thing I'm glad is that there are no extant photographs, at least any good ones, of John Milton. At least anyone try and find any comparison. How'd you have to wake up someday and find out they found some photographs of Milton and you look just like him? Last time we talked about how a third element that we were calling criticism was needed to add to the first two of acts and facts to properly crank up and to run the great machine of civilization, and in fact each person's individual intellectual development. And we were using examples more or less that apparently were out there. But would you further consider a little bit? We were talking about critics when we were apparently talking about out there, and I was using examples such as actual critics of art and music and literature and politics and etc. Still assuming that all of you can keep in mind that if this does not have some reference more than to an actual person or some critic out there and then a bunch of artists, if you don't understand this has to do with individual neuronic activity in you, then indeed we are back to rehashing Milton. No, we're not. No. But on the basis of apparently talking about people out there, critics, experts, which is what a critic appears to be. It's a part of the moving, if you recall, of us setting up that kind of civilized sequence in a three-dimensional world run by polarized energy, of it being silent primary facts, and then the nervous system in man reaches such a point that it ignites and begins to talk, and that is the world of facts. And then again, using this kind of ephemeral, linear sequence, then after facts comes what we were calling criticism, which is really another form of facts. It has to keep this process going, or civilization, the development of man singularly and collectively, would come to a screeching. So criticism, remember, is still a form of facts. And it is at any given time an apparent form, at the crudest level, of expertise. That if we're talking about out here to get us going again, and we're actually talking about, oh, look, there comes so-and-so, he is the art critic for the New York Times. And he looks and he critiques this painting or music idea. It is on the basis that he is an expert, or else the criticism does not even begin to fly. You can't even get out on the runway in the ordinary world. Whether you agree or not, it's on the basis that whoever can come up with a third stage in any particular off sequence from acts to facts and then the next stage. Then he has to look back at the second one, if he's at the third position, and he has to critique what's already gone on factually. And to critique it and it to actually mean anything is a form of expertise. Whether you agree or not, you can say, well, yeah, I know who he is, but his idea about what this represents, or his continuing attack on abstract or neo-abstract expressionism, is completely wasted. The man is behind the times. But still you are accepting a form of expertise as issuing from this source, even though you're disagreeing with it. Thusly what? I was going to ask if you'd consider it a little bit further, that in the city, in ordinary city civilized affairs, you cannot, there is an important step, you cannot be an expert without one absolutely critical, inescapable step. Does anyone know what it is? What is this, a damn quiz show? You'd never guess. Trust me. I just barely guessed and I made it up. There's one absolutely inescapable step necessary to be an expert, to play your part in the third step. What is it? You got to announce you are. So you'd never thought of that. Now that I say it, of course, some ordinary people, what are they doing in here? They could say, Jesus Christ, give me another example of the obvious. You shouldn't say that. If it was obvious, how come you couldn't get it? I don't know, it was a trick. Yeah. But notice, you could, after you once hear it, go, wait a minute, that's so obvious that we're back to running the merry-go-round backwards again. It's more than silly. It's silly to run backwards. Nuh-uh. For this third stage, after acts, facts, and then to get the, which in a sense would create simple existence in a three-dimensional world, just that polarized basis. But to actually crank it up and to take on the living appearance, whatever name you would prefer, of civilization, culture, progress, evolution, civilized existence, then it has to move beyond just the facts, just beyond the secondary comments on that which has gone before. Then the facts have to comment on themselves and must keep going in that kind of direction. So to be an expert, which is, after at least the second stage, if there was an all-inclusive second stage somewhere, but we're now to where everyone is almost your own third stage, that you're having to do it to yourself, which we'll get to in a minute. But it's like at any particular, if we're talking about one segment of life's body, one civilization, one nation, one culture somewhere, then their third step has to be a continual looking back at what happened and critiquing it. And you must be an expert to critique it, or it doesn't matter. You can't just be a whole bunch of bulldoze operators that you say, well, what do you think of the, whatever the term would be at that particular time, what do you think of the post-deconstructionist novels of the 80s? And you got all these, for some reason, that you now are looking to all the collective bulldozer operators to critique what has been literature for that decade, and they all go, yeah. That will not work. That may be their sentiments, but that is not being an expert. And it does not have anything to do with their level of education or their profession. It has to do that there has to be something else. There has to be a form of criticism. There has to be an effect that this next stage is having on the previous stage. That is what progress seems to be. If you consider it that, take a crude example, that if indeed at one time, that in the early dark ages, that they thought that the world was flat. And then it went into at least the 16th century to where even the man in the street would say, Jesus is flat out here in the street. That even ordinary people now had the notion that, wait, the world is an orb, it is round. All right, if you said that that was progress, you'd understand it could not be, it would not have happened to rent the very fabric of this parade of progress if everyone believed the world was flat. And if they did, that would have been the facts at the time. It would not be that simply a whole bunch of illiterate pig farmers, which instead of bulldozer operators, because I know that many of you would probably say that there was a dearth of diesel engines available in the 16th century, and therefore you wouldn't go with the example, so we'll call it pig or beet farmers. Because it could have been beet pig farmers that were real tired. If they all said, no, the world's not flat, we think it's, and then whatever, triangular or even round, you do understand that to really play with this for a second, just I'm trying to get you to see something, not just get a laugh. It would not, they were not experts. It would not have had the same effect. There had to be somebody, singularly, individually, but there had to be a kind of collective third stage, and of course every third stage, the criticism stage, then there has to be a fourth, which is the third back to that one. They have to look upon it, but it has to be a form of expertise. In other words, life does not stumble around under the guise of non-experts. The El Stupidos of the world do not make history. That's just the way life works. Don't look at people, don't look at individuals and think, well, yes, of course that's part of what you're supposed to do if you're on a real side trip, is, hey, all the famous people in history, almost all of them's been educated. Therefore, I'm going to give up, some of my beer on the weekend so that my little tyke can go to college because maybe he'll be famous and they'll pull him out of this sorry life of being a bulldozer operator and an attorney on the side. There is this feel that life keeps doing that. If we had more education, that'd be the answer. We'd all be off the street and get out of these empty refrigerator boxes and we'd have a nice car. Because you look at history, and apparently it was people with some intellectual wherewithal, if not actual academic background, that seemed to make history. It is simply that life works in a particular way, and the men take it what? Personally. That is why you have books of biographical information on people, You want to look up famous people, you don't look up. There should just be one listing. Under L, life. But no, you look under there and it says Einstein, Galileo, and some of them I hear even say Milton. But you look in there, and apparently people did it. The point being, even when it comes out in this life doing it, when it comes out at the individual level, to be what seems to be a useful tool in the civilized machine, helping make it run. That is, you become a critic, you become an observer, you become an expert. There's one thing that is absolutely unavoidable, and it's not education, it's not looks, it's not charm, it's not what you know. All that is somewhat fungible. But there's one thing that is inescapable. To be an expert in the civilized affairs of man, you have got to say you are. Think about it. Think about it. Because at first, if we were going to take an ordinary intellectual position, if we were going to speak for ordinary intelligence, you could say, well, besides that being as silly as a merry-go-round running backwards, it's just not even true. Because at first you might think, unless you put it into too plain of words, and then even you might gag on it if you're ordinary, but at first you might think, wait a minute, if you're an expert in something, it's not necessary that you tell somebody, that you don't have to go around advertising, you don't have to blow your own horn. Some way, how does it go? Talent will out. You cannot be an expert. You can be an expert with no education. You can be an expert in how boils on your face. You can be an expert and be a bigamist or even a smallamist. All kinds of things, but you cannot be an expert until you speak up. Life does not recognize, now I don't mean life in the way we normally say it, the civilized world, the machinery of civilization does not recognize you're not sought out. Life, that is civilization, does not come and knock on the door and say, wait a minute, we have been, in our mystical way here in the city, we have been keeping track of you, and you now are the smartest person. You now have the keenest of eye, the sharpest of wit, having to do with blank. Architecture, literature, religion, morals. And we're here to seek out your wisdom. Hey, hold your breath, all right? Not in your lifetime. Not in anyone's lifetime. To be an expert, you got to speak up. To even be any possibility of you being an expert. Would anyone care to, again, be reminded that if this doesn't have anything to do further than actual experts and people out in the city and somebody knocking on your door, all inside. How do you become an expert? How do you know what you know? Well, I just know it. Not hardly. Not hardly, oh dear. No. Nobody's an expert on anything until what? I told you twice. Until you announce you are. Doesn't mean it's not a possibility. It's not necessarily that you will be recognized in the world apparently out there. But for there even to be the possibility of you being an expert and playing a part in the moving of acts to facts to criticism, and then facts to criticism, and the machine moving right along, even for you to possibly play some role of which you might be aware, or which you might hope, even others of which they might be aware. To be an expert, even the possibility, you got to speak up. You got to say you are. I can't resist. I'm going to ask you again. Think about it. Sometimes it's even dumb and splendid enough that I know some of you, even you, want to pause. Got to say you are. It's not just in conflict with what everybody believes. It's not just some kind of cheap slap in the face of life. Not if you see it right. Not just because I put it together in a certain way, but once you begin to see it, it's not running in conflict. It's not actually trying to run logic backwards. It's not trying to run the machinery, the merry-go-round of life in an opposite direction. That's silly. You could be a teenager. You could be an absolute mechanical rebel. You could just have your hormones running wild and do that. You could put on a beret and take up a fake French accent and play like it's the 1959s and holler, where are the barricades? That kind of stuff proves nothing. It's not just running. It's not just putting your dumb head down and running at life and logic and morality and hollering, screw everything. This goes off in such a direction as once you begin to see it. Because who would have ever thought, if I insisted there was one thing absolutely inescapable at every time, every period, no matter where you're on this planet, for there be a possibility of all of you being an expert, that you got to say so. You've got to say so in a certain way, and then you've got to follow it up. You have got to offer, after you may list your degrees and your background, which is of little consequence if you can begin to see this. You got to announce you are, but then you've got to follow it up with a certain kind of important supporting evidence. Primarily, anecdotal. I mean, degrees is one thing. So, well, yes, I graduated from Harvard. Yeah. And I worked for the New York Times for 10 years. Yeah. And I had 6 books. They're used as text in their field. Yeah. And it's as though life is waiting. The nervous system of life in the channel in which we are currently floating. And in a sense, like, yeah. And it waits for you to hear. You know, it's funny. I was talking to my wife last night about this very thing. And then everybody goes, oh. Because here comes important supporting evidence that, yes, I'm an expert in this field. You give degrees. You give back, yeah. And then you say, funny thing happened to me on the way over here tonight. Then you're getting close. But again, if you can get past any inclination on your poor part, mechanical part, to take that sarcastically, it's not just going against what you'd normally think. It's not even, it just goes off somewhere else. Because I was repeated twice, important supporting evidence. But from any ordinary view, you would think, well, if there is important supporting evidence for your ipsedixit claim to be an expert in some field, it certainly wouldn't be anecdotal. It'd be the very things, apparently, that I was dismissing. Degrees, background, But anecdotal, what the hell, that's not even, it's beyond just being sarcastic or making fun of ordinary life and the way things operate. It's just, what the hell does it mean? It means everything. Everything. If you want to, remember, we're using the idea of criticism, and I was saying the world apparently out there, and professional critics, actual people that apparently are playing a role out there of being an art critic or etc. But how about, besides those kind of professional critics, there's also the ever popular amateur level of criticism. Amateur critic and expert, which is, comparably speaking, being an expert on you. Now it's not you saying, well, I would like to give my voice my opinion, my expertise, my criticism of something out there, life, crime, social mores, economics, whatever. That would be more, let's call it the professional level. The amateur level of being an expert and a critic is towards oneself. Still at that level, you got to speak up. You cannot even be an amateur, unpaid critic, cum expert on you without one thing. You got to say you are. All right. Well, if you force me, all right, I'll give you an example. They're doing a person in the street interview. The city is holding a special day concerned about the environment and all other neat stuff that cities are concerned about. And they have mass transit day. And they have a person in the street interview, and they ask the person in the street for their opinion. A person. Nice, sane, everyday person. They ask their reaction, their feel about mass transit. Its benefits and why they propose that it seems, you know the city is having this day, and you know all the questions about pollution and the carbons in the air and all this, and why people should be in favor of mass transit. And the person, yes. And they say, well, we'd like, what would you say about this? And the person says, well, I'm an asthmatic, and so I'm especially, etc., which is all right. But I ask you again, think about it a second. What in the hell, at one level, and I'm just being theatrically smart-ass, as you know, because that's not it, but what in the hell does this person's health problems have to do with the question? The question is, what about mass transit? And you look up and there's huge subways and it's buses and they're digging holes for subways down there. And the person very sincerely, oh yes, right up to date. What do you think about it? And the first words out of their mouth is, well, I'm an asthmatic and so I especially. And you go, what is the connection? How can this be? What does her health or his health problems have to do with the question? Of course, the answer is simple. It has everything to do with it. How else can the person respond? See, it's not an attack on people, but you've got to be able to think in a way beyond the crudely obvious. Because the crudely obvious, if I had to go back and do it for you, is the person seems to be making a most poignant. Forget somebody like me trying to make fun of this. I mean, it's enough to make fun of the poor woman or man's health problems, but then I'm making fun of their contribution to try and improve the environment for the rest of us. Because the obvious reason that the person said, well, yes, I got the question, I understand what you want. All right. It's sort of funny you asked me because I'm an asthmatic. Now, the obvious thing is they're going to say, I'm an asthmatic, and so I, in particular, am in favor of anything that will help improve the breathability, as I believe they say, of our air, especially here in the cities. And so you really picked a fine person to ask this question because, I have my own personal reasons to be in favor of this. All right, there's the obvious part, right? But now back. What's going on in life? And we'll assume even you people out there in TV land. I don't know why I keep thinking that people in TV land can refrain from being sarcastic and just taking a short, polarized view of any of this and thinking, well, that's just some kind of cynical. And I keep saying, I assume you people out there in TV land are not that way. Hell, I know you are. You wouldn't be in TV land. What the hell are you doing sitting at home watching this kind of stuff? So I know you are. I'm just being nice about it. Is to be able to ask yourself, as I did, that kind of question about there's another form of obviousness going on here, because you could say, wait a minute. As soon as you hear it, and it's not just this poor person in the street going, it's the presidents, it's popes, it's you. That life apparently is running energy in a certain way at the factual level, not just individual. It happens in great gigantic blocks, known as great gigantic blocks. No, epochs of history is what it's known as. Movements of history. That there seems to be life presenting questions like, what do you think about us promoting? What do you think about the public support of mass transit? And the person says, well, I have breathing problems. All right, from one obvious level, how come the whole interview, the camera person, the interviewer, the TV station, assuming this is on TV or they're taping it, how come suddenly everything doesn't stop and say, wait a minute, you squirt brain. I didn't ask you about your health problems. I mean, tut, and I'm sorry and all that, but I don't give a damn if you drop dead. I'm here trying to I got a question. No. Because they could say, well, wait a minute. No need to be harsh with me. I was getting to that point. I wanted to point out that I could particularly respond to this question in a most meaningful, personal manner because I do have trouble breathing. All right, once you get that far, you think, well, boy, we sure put our foot in it to attack the poor person because they were getting around to the question. Well, everything always gets around to the question. That's why you have the civilization machine. That you're only ordinarily dumb. You're only ordinary to ever have an idea that, wait a minute, people are not responding to the questions. I've heard your examples here before, said somebody out there in TV land. Even though you say not to be sarcastic, boy, I get a good rich laugh at other people's expense because you keep pointing out that people out there in life, they try to interview each other, or kids talk to their family, and priests talk to people in the confessional booth saying, what are you doing over there? And all this goes on, and other people do not actually respond in a proper way. Boy, you're right. The whole world's full of, who knows what. Bunch of dumbasses. No. From one level, they don't respond, but if you only stop there, all you're going to do is you're your own critic. You're saying, oh, look at those dumb people. Remember, I was asking you to also consider, how about the interviewer from last time that was asking, what was that interviewer asking? Tell us why it is that there has been hardly any serious criticism of painting itself since the 70s. And you remember the critic, the expert, says, ooh, boy, good, difficult question, but well, first, I'm in full agreement. You have put your finger on it, and then they spend 3 or 4 minutes, and they never answer it. And I was going through the kinds of things that the interviewer, if they could get past the obvious, and may I refer you back to your own brain and forget all this stuff about out there. The interviewer cannot ask obvious things such as, how come I put up with this? How come I'll ask a question and I will accept a non-answer as an answer? One more time, forget about out there, forget interviewers and all that, in here. But it seems to be the same thing for you couch potatoes. The interviewer, how come they can't say, wait a minute, how come I sit here and nod, no, and the person is not answering the question? And another one, how come the interviewer can't say, wait a minute, this other person is as reasonable and sane as I seem to be, and he's the expert, he's got to know he's not answering the question. He's nodding along, watching me nod and taking like I'm making notes, and he's got to know he's not answering the question. And then there was one other, when we was running out of tape last time, if you recall. How come that kind of interviewer, that kind of neural activity on your own that's responding to other apparently incoming neural activity, that you're apparently questioning live, trying to figure out how things go and not fall in a hole, how come the interviewer cannot just say, wait a minute, how come I can't not only remember the 2 observations I just made, the question about how come I'm nodding along and how come the person doesn't know that he's not answering the question anyway, how come I can't remember that this is not some kind of cheap farce? Of course it may be, but that's not going to do any good to stop there. Unless you find out how to get your money back. You got your ticket and you got to ride the train. Don't tell me I switch metaphors. You can ride a train while sitting in your seat. Not on the train seat, in your theater seat. You can't get your money back. If you can, ignore this part. How come the interviewer cannot say, all right, there's something else going on here besides the apparent verbal interplay. Either that or this is not a cheap farce. Such a frightening farce that I do not want to think about it. Which could be true, but we don't go into that. And so how come the interviewer cannot just keep some continuing awareness that, wait a minute, in all of these situations, in all of life, there is something going on besides what's apparently going on, especially at the conversational level. Or else, everybody, in some degree, would be going through the kinds of things that I've been trying to get you to go through and on a non-hostile, non-polarized basis. Wait a minute, what the hell has your health problem got to do with mass transit? Or, hey, why do you spend 5 minutes telling me what a good question I ask, and you get through, I can tell you, you're about to get to the end. I can hear the end of the verse coming up. You're about to go back to the tonic. You're about to end this verse, and I'm going to sit here and nod like, very meaningful, and you hadn't done anything except keep repeating my question. How come this is going on? How come nobody notices this? You can't just notice that head on. Because there's another obviousness. There is another form of expertise. There's another form of criticism that is not part of the mass movement of the civilization machine. Consider it, if I can try to narrow your focus. Since, if you recall, let me prove it again, that since neither art, civilization, or even one's apparent individual personality can exist, not as a fully functioning entity, any of the 3 I just mentioned, without criticism. They just cannot get going. They are not growing. They are not alive. If it appeared to be you individually, if it appeared to be some specific field, area of interest of humanity, such as art or music, or if you just looked upon the full spectrum of humanity as civilization. If it's alive and moving, then it only got to be so by some form of criticism. Back to the good thing of, Jehovah saying he'd already set up acts and facts, Adam and Eve, but it was nothing. The story is not even interesting until he says, hey, where'd that apple core come from? Uh-oh. And he says, I told you. Now we got criticism. Now we've got the third element, and then the story gets interesting, I guess. A lot of people wave Bibles, and at any rate, the story was just nothing. You could say, well, they did exist. The story was there. Adam and Eve, and he put them in the Garden of Eden, and he said, you got nothing to do except have fun. And don't eat off that tree. If that was then, you'd think, well, I wonder how they're doing. Now it's been 16 billion or 1 billion years later, and you hadn't heard anything. You figure, well, boy, what a boring life that must be. The thing did not actually get operating until there was that third element that we're calling for the time being criticism. Facts beginning to factualize about themselves, in a sense being able to cannibalize themselves. It's facts being able to critique themselves, not facts critiquing acts. They can, but it's meaningless. It's like somebody condemning sex, not something specifically about sex, but just somebody, if a man popped up, you can still, life still uses, as we mentioned, critiques factually of certain forms of sex, like people attacking pornography, which is not sex, that's a factual version of sex. But notice, nobody, there's no sane notice given. If it pops up, it's just a pimple. It's just an aberration. Nobody pops up and factually condemns any act, that is, sex itself. A man does not stand up and says, all right, we got to get past all this worrying about pornography and worry about sex outside of marriage or before your marriage. Hey, wait, we got to get past all that. That's child's play. We got to stop sex. There is no viable, there is no useful critiquing, factualizing about acts. The secondary world has no profit. It is meaningless. It's got nothing to do with the machinery of life. For secondary affairs, that is the factual life of man, to directly criticize acts. You do not criticize eating. You may criticize dining. You may criticize particular food. You may criticize eating too much, eating the wrong food and all that. But you understand that the second stage does not turn directly on the first stage of acts and criticize it. That kind of kid cannot criticize the old man. There's nothing to criticize. It's meaningless. There's nothing else to say. It's only the third stage that then facts, in a sense, begin to turn on themselves. Not in just the binary, polarized sense, because it actually moves forward. But it is that facts have to begin to criticize themselves. They have to become experts on themselves. It is true not just with civilization and these areas of arts and music, etc. The individual. So when you get to that level, you've got to have the third element, and you have got to be an expert on yourself. You have got to be, now forget absolutely any kind of interviewer and TV show and all that crap. You have got to be an expert on yourself. You have got to be an interviewer, and you have got to be a critic. Or you are not functioning. You are not civilized. You are not going anywhere. You are dead. You are brain dead. You are civilized dead. You may be walking around. That's not even the point. But you are not fully functioning, even at the ordinary level, unless you're a critic. But notice also, taking that in the most direct manner, notice that in the more civilized you are nowadays in the three-dimensional world, the more is a kind of psychological fault-finding with people being self-critical. That you have all the self-help groups and support groups of, tut-tut. Don't feel bad just because you have been addicted to cocaine and Jack Daniels simultaneously. And just because you've ruined your whole life, hey, it's not your fault. Come over here with us. Us fuck-ups anonymous or whoever it is. We take everybody. It's not right or wrong. I just want you to know by now. In other words, it's part of life growing, by the way. I'm not saying that's wrong. It's part of life growing. But notice there always has been, and right now we're in an easy area where it's even blossoming out bigger, that people should not feel guilty. That we should be beyond, especially such provincial, confining things as religious guilt, Christian guilt, Jewish guilt, Muslim guilt, all kinds of guilt. No. Come on. Just because you are inclined, just because you have an addictive personality, it's not your fault. It's not because that God cursed you. It's not because you're working for demons. It's not because of some kind of character flaw. Quit feeling guilty. That doesn't help. Come over here and join our group. Read our books. Call us. If you feel like you're about to be addictive, call us up. But notice from another view, it's not that they're wrong. That is part of progress. Absolutely. But notice from another view, what I am telling you, if you caught a glimpse for the last couple of nights, from one view, it's a form of attempted suicide. It's not going to work. That's not what it's doing. But to tell people don't feel guilty, from one sense, the game continually changes. Remember, the parade keeps going. So anywhere you stand, you go, wait a minute. The Elephants are doing it in the street. Or I don't like that band. They're playing John Philip Sousa in the wrong key. That doesn't matter. All you got to do, you turn your head from it, and you turn around, and the parade, you're at another spot. So it's not that it's right or wrong. But from one view, and it's still, the description I'm using is still valid, it is asking for suicide to say, don't feel guilty. Because you would not be consciously alive as a civilized human were it not for this self-criticism. Now, I know everybody attributes it, like you do everything else, the kind of directions that would make one civilized. Remember the guy at the dinner party, semi-fancy dinner party, that he asked Kairuth the question that, hey, if man's civilized conduct was not apparently directed, if our instructions did not come from somewhere out there, how would we civilized even know how to behave? Everyone assumed you got no other choice. At the old site, the brain, consciousness, intelligence, apparently takes in everything it knows from where? Well, it's obvious, you dumb mother. From out there. You had to go to school, you had to ask your father, the old man, you had to ask your mother, you had to ask people, and you had to collect information from out there. That information, I refer you one more time, scratched on the cornerstone of that crumbling artifice under the city hall that said, you shall know the facts, and from now on out, feel guilty about it. That is, the intellect started to live. Now, at the ordinary level, people take criticism as being a form of guilt, and they believe what was put upon me. It's not just so bad being addicted to cocaine. I mean, I know it bothered my health, and part of my nose is missing. But, that's not even the worst part. The worst part is how I suffered over it before I met you guys and got in this group, the support group, and found out that, hey, it's not my fault. But everybody said it was. My mother, every time the police would arrest me, and everybody would say, hey, you got to stop this. And so I felt guilty, but now I realize I shouldn't have felt guilty. That, in fact, kept me partially from an attempted recovery because I just felt guilty. If this thing is operating, as it said under City Hall, that old cornerstone they found, once you know the facts, once you reach the second stage, to get it moving, you got to reach the third stage. That is, you should know the facts. That is, you begin to think. And as soon as you do, you don't need God. You don't need to be Jewish. You don't need to be addicted to cocaine. As soon as you know the facts, that is, as soon as you reach the second stage, collectively, individually, which if it's going on collectively, it's going on you individually. As soon as you know the facts, you reach the second stage, you also reach the third stage. You don't have to worry about it. You don't have to look around and say, who's going to make me feel guilty? Where am I going to find out? Of course, that sounds silly. You think, well, nobody does that. Oh, no. You think, well, I sought information. I sought direction. I sought help. No. You can call it that. I sought education, the facts, yeah. What you sought was criticism. You had to have the third stage. So the idea that we should be escaping from feelings of guilt and etc., it is part of the civilized machinery. But I just want you to see that in one view, it's just the third stage going on to the fourth stage, and the fourth becoming a fifth, and it all becomes a third stage to the one that was right before it. But what is ordinarily thought about as being criticism is, to steal again from that great storehouse of wisdom, the political field, Criticism is mother's milk, not graft. Unless you're just strictly a politician, not payoffs. Criticism. And so the idea that, boy, we shouldn't feel guilty, that may be tomorrow's news. That may be tomorrow somewhere in the great rolling machine. Don't bet on it. They can simply change the name is one thing. But the criticism, it has to be, or else everything would stop. There would be no, even at the ordinary sequential three-dimensional level, there would be no change in anything. We would all still be looking at Rembrandt and thinking, well, you'll never beat that. Boy, does that make you want to gag? Or we would all still be listening to Buxtehude or Carole King or one of those old-time composers and think, well, they hadn't been any good music since so-and-so. Boy, doesn't that give you the chills? Or you think, hey, don't talk to me about sports. I mean, since the Dodgers moved from Brooklyn, hey, forget it. No. There has to be criticism of yesterday. There has to be the third one. And it is a form that comes out individually as guilt. And to be an expert on yourself, you got to feel guilty. No matter what you call it. And do not attribute it to your parents. Don't attribute it to your religion, your culture. It's life. It's your breath. And to be an expert on you, just the same way as getting civilization cranked up or any art cranked up, the criticism has to take on what seems to be a personal feel. That they ask you, not about mass transit now, but they ask, how do you feel about being a human? How do you feel about trying to be famous? How do you feel about being a would-be artist? And what's the first thing you say? Well, I hadn't been feeling good lately anyway. You say, what the hell does this have to do with what you're trying to do in life? Everything! The answer is everything. Because if you don't speak up, what you're saying is by saying, well, I'm an asthmatic. You're saying, I'm an expert on me. You're saying, I am able to critique myself. And boy, do I deserve it. Are we out of tape? Everyone must tell about themselves. Which is getting back around to, I know that some of you take it as being a direct attack about everyone having to tell what kind of guy they are. Or that you ask somebody, how do you feel about hunger in Ethiopia? I'm a little overweight myself. I didn't ask you about you. Yes, you did. There is no ordinary information. There is no ordinary operation of the intellect without it being criticism, and it has to be self-directed. Not in an ordinary sense that you're attacking you. It has to be that all facts are self-referring to you. What else is anybody going to say about mass transit? What are you going to say about hunger in Ethiopia? Or what are you going to say about people who are riding mass transit and who are hungry? Well, you got to start off, and you got to end off by saying, well, I'm an overweight asthmatic. Now we're getting somewhere. Au revoir.